Nobody said anything. These men just disappeared from the communities and the wives were left destitute. Some gratitude for helping us out in World War II, that turned out to be.
He told me that they served them out the beds and dragged them out to the buses.
They were raiding for 3 or 4 days. There's stories of men hiding in attics, trying to sneak out and being caught in the entry.
And took them down to the docks to be deported.
And then I've got no doubt. I don't know what it's like to have a dad.
I'm Jamie Owen, and this is The Secret Betrayal. In this series of podcasts, the story of how a brutal policy of forced repatriation caused thousands of Chinese men to disappear from Liverpool at the end of the Second World War. This policy, orchestrated by the British government, would leave families broken and the community traumatised. But the story starts 80 years earlier, towards the end of the Industrial Revolution, when in 1866 a shipping group, Alfred Holt and Company, was founded in Liverpool. They quickly became one of the UK's biggest shipping merchants, building established trade routes between Liverpool, Shanghai and Hong Kong. Their major subsidiary, the Blue Funnel Line, carried cotton, tea and silk and relied heavily on Chinese sailors, as Rana Mitter, a historian specialising in modern China at the University of Oxford, explains.
Shanghai was not only the major port in China's Republican period, but it was also one of the major cities of British Empire during that period. And this meant that the community that grew up there was one that involved a lot of professional sailors who would, in fact, in many cases, travel with British shipping outward into the wider ambit of the empire, which included sometimes to the UK itself, to Britain. And Liverpool became one of the major cities that saw an increasing number of Chinese sailors, quite often associated with the merchant navy, who would be part of that diaspora.
Over time, many of these seamen and traders settled in Liverpool, and on the eve of the Second World War, the city was home to a thriving British-Chinese community of thousands of people. I travelled to Liverpool to meet Kay Jones, lead curator of urban and community history at the Museum of Liverpool. As a city which grew on the back of its port, which employed many nationalities, was it a cosmopolitan city?
Absolutely, yes. One of the oldest Chinese communities, the oldest black community. Lots of people came from all over the world to work at the port and the docks. So there was a real mix of different communities and different peoples in the city.
And how important was that community to the functioning of Liverpool as a port?
Absolutely key. Those people working within the city, providing all those kind of trades that really made the city function as a whole, that still continued, but sometimes in different ways throughout the war.
Many of the Chinese men had begun to put down deep roots in the city. They lived there, got married and had children. However, the vibrance and strategic importance of Liverpool made it vulnerable in a time of war.
Liverpool is a key strategic target because of the port and the docks. Munitions and food and really key essentials were coming through the port to massive number of destinations across the world, so it was a key strategic port. So the enemy really had to target Liverpool to stop that key trade coming through the port and how that was helping the war effort, the Allied war effort across the world.
Can you give us some sort of insight as to what this city must have been like to live in? And I'm thinking from the perspective of those foreign sailors who call this home. I mean, they didn't grow up here, they came here to help with the war effort, and they found themselves in, well, a living hell, presumably.
Yeah, of course, they were serving the country. Family members were being bombed in Chinatown also, so there was still that they were at risk serving the country, but also those concerns like every service person, what is happening to my family back home?
China made a major contribution to the ultimate Allied victory in the Second World War. First of all, China was the first country, which eventually would become an Allied country, that actually plunged into the conflict, because it began in China in July 1937, not in September 1939, as in Europe. Of course, for the first 4.5 years, China was fighting pretty much close to on its own against the Japanese who had invaded in 1937. There was financial and a certain amount of limited unofficial military assistance from some of the Western allies, the British and the Americans, as well as the Soviets. But overall, it was Chinese troops who had to bear the burden.
China's contribution to the Allies' victory is often overlooked by the West, as Rana Mitter explains.
Had China not been fighting in the first half of the war, before the Western allies came in, then it's possible to see a very different and perhaps possibly more problematic outcome of the war, in which Japan could either have won or at least come to some sort of compromise rather than ultimately being defeated.
During the Second World War, the numbers of foreign merchant seamen expanded in response to the needs of war. 1 in 7 seamen in Britain's merchant navy was from China. The contribution of Chinese seamen was picked out for special praise in a film made by the British government in 1944. The narrator tells his audience that many Chinese in Britain were doing an important job.
So too are the thousands of Chinese seamen now serving with the Allied merchant navy, bringing food to Britain, munitions from America, cargoes from Africa and the East, and getting the convoys through to Russia, India, Australia. China fights not only on the land in the East, engaging huge Japanese forces, but in the West, her men fight on the merchant navy front, shoulder to shoulder in the greatest battle of naval history, alongside their British seamen comrades. They too brave the torpedoes and the bombs and the mines, making history under fire.
However vital their role, there was no legal route under British law for foreign seamen discharged from ships in the UK to settle here. Kellyanne Flower's grandfather, Chow Si-Fa, was repatriated to China not once, but twice. I caught up with her in Liverpool to find out about her grandfather's role in the merchant navy.
The whole Chinese community was acting as support to the British troops. The seamen were acting as support to the British troops and running food and things like that right the way through the war. So they were commended on the British newsreels of Pathé News, how wonderful they'd been to Britain, how much they'd helped the war effort, how they were fabulous citizens. And within a year of that news report, they decided to secretly round them all up and deport them without informing the families.
So he was sailing back and forth to Liverpool and they were delivering, what, food and provisions to the UK?
We're just kind of told supplies to the troops, so we assume it was mainly food because they weren't carrying weaponry and things like that.
Without which, I mean, the country would have
It had ground to a
stopped.
halt, and the troops wouldn't have been able to do the things that they were doing if they were been unfed and left to starve. So they were definitely an essential part of the war effort.
So what do we know about Grandad?
Not a lot, really. I mean, we've got a name. We know he worked for Blue Funnel and he was a merchant seaman. We know he was deported and that it was done secretly. So the first time nobody really understood what had happened, just a lot of the community had vanished. So we made it back after his first deportation and did actually marry my nan, but he was rounded up again and deported for a second time.
The need for labour to support the war effort greatly increased Liverpool's Chinese population during the war years. But limitations on immigration status allowed shipping companies to pay lower wages to Chinese seamen. In 1939, a Chinese seaman's rate of pay varied between 25% and 50% of a British seaman's wage. If they protested, they could be threatened with deportation. But after Japan entered the war in 1942, they couldn't be sent back to China, and industrial action led to a settlement that raised their wages significantly. Although they still received less than their British counterparts, the shipping companies and the authorities saw them as troublemakers. Anne Pearson's grandparents were among those couples affected.
The British government put a shout out for help because our men were at war, the English men were at war, and 20,000 Chinese merchant seamen came over. And that's exactly what they did, was they gave safe passage to the ammunition, to the food, to all the supplies. When in about 1942 they had a strike because they was paid a third of the Englishman's pay, and so they had a strike so they would be treated equal, and they won that. The consequence of that was that the government then, if they was married, they took the British wives' passports off them and gave them alien cards. And they did the same with the merchant seamen, so they was never allowed to register, and they were seen as trouble causers from the strike in 1942.
In 1945, as the war in Europe ended, the shipping companies wanted Chinese seamen in Liverpool back on lower rates of pay, which meant getting them to sign on in Asian rather than British ports. The Chinese sailors, lauded as heroes by the government just months before, were now branded undesirable troublemakers who should be repatriated and, if possible, deported. While the companies put economic pressure on the Chinese sailors in Liverpool by denying them work, the government changed the men's landing conditions so they could be forced to board ships taking them back to China.
So when we got to the end of the war and the Englishmen were coming back and wanted the jobs back, they had a secret Home Office meeting where it was discussed in Whitehall what to do about the Chinese merchant seamen, and they decided they would round them up and forcibly repatriate them, not tell the wives, not make it public knowledge, and that's what they did with the help of the shipping lines, and they put the files into secret documents to be shelved for 50 years.
Joe Phillips is the son of one of the Chinese men who simply disappeared overnight. He believes the servicemen were targeted not just for being Chinese, but also for demanding equality at a time of deep prejudice in Britain.
They wanted to be on the same rate of pay as the normal English seamen. And obviously they've made noises about it, and the easiest thing was to do is get rid of them. And that's what they did do. They got rid of them. They was alien, they was gangsters, call them whatever you want, but that's how they was treated. And I've read in some of these catalogues what these yellow people, these people shouldn't even be here. I've read some of these documented things that the captains have said, and there was only ever third-class citizens. There was never first, always third-class citizens. And that goes to the prejudice of the day in the 1946s and the 47s. Everybody knows, without me explaining, the prejudices.
Once Japan was defeated and repatriation was possible, the government and shipping companies were keen to get going. On the 19th of October 1945, at a secret meeting in the Home Office, ministers and civil servants agreed a policy called compulsory repatriation of undesirable Chinese seamen. Their motivation was summed up by one of the shipping company officials.
The Chinese population of Liverpool has swollen from some 200 to 2,000, largely as a result of Chinese seamen coming to this country and becoming unemployed or unemployable. They have caused a good deal of trouble to the police, but it has not hitherto been possible to get rid of them. Now it is proposed to set in motion the usual steps for getting rid of foreign seamen whose presence here is unwelcome.
This unsympathetic view set the tone for how the repatriation of Chinese seamen was managed in Liverpool.
It just looks like a racist decision. There's no other real conclusion to be had. They were called undesirables. They referred to them as, criminal class, and they made some pretty nasty remarks about the wives. One of the papers says they were prostitute class. So they were just classed as nothing, really. And when the end of the war came and they felt they'd served their purpose, they didn't even feel a need to be nice to them or thankful to them for the job they've done. They just rounded them all up and deported them.
Mass repatriation was swift and had largely been achieved by mid-1946. Home Office figures in July that year give a total of just under 5,000 repatriations. The shipping companies were keen to facilitate the mass removals, even converting cargo holds to accommodate more passengers, as Kellyanne explains.
They altered the holds in the ships and they just filled the ships, left the ships docked in the middle of the Mersey so the men couldn't swim to shore. And they spent several days just rounding Chinese men up and putting them on the ships. And I think the wives may have thought they were being, you know, redistributed or redeployed to other ships. They didn't know that it was a full-on deportation.
As states in the report that was commissioned by the former Immigration Minister, Kevin Foster, race was a key factor in the decision to forcibly repatriate those seamen. You know, they were seen as troublemakers, they were paid a lower wage when they were on the ships, and they took action and forced the companies to increase their pay. So they were seen as troublemakers as well, you know, so but race was a key factor, I believe, in their forced deportation.
Kim Johnson, Labour MP for Liverpool Riverside, is campaigning for justice for the families of the deported.
From my point of view, it's very synonymous with Windrush. People were asked to come to this country after the war to work in the NHS, to work in public services, to rebuild this country, which they did. You know, they gave their life to. And then, after giving their life, they were then again forcibly repatriated back to a country that they didn't know. You know, so there were elements of racism involved.
Kim isn't the first Labour MP to take up the cause of the Chinese seamen's families. Bessie Braddock was a British Labour MP and social reform campaigner in Liverpool. In December 1945, she addressed this issue in the House of Commons.
There are many cases in this country, and particularly in the ports, where women have married foreigners and the men have now returned to their ports of origin, leaving no trace. In Liverpool, there were a tremendous number of Chinese seamen when the war broke out and their home ports were closed. The Maritime Agreement made it imperative that those men should be returned home as soon as their ports of origin were open. They have been in Liverpool and other seaport towns for some 4 or 5 years. They have legally married English women, and these women have perhaps 2 or 3 children. Now that the ports of origin of these men are open, they are being compelled by the shipping companies to return to the ports of origin, the shipping companies having no further obligation to pay the men's maintenance while they remain in port. The women, who are left with 2 or 3 children, have no possibility of getting any sort of maintenance from the men they have married.
Why were the authorities so keen to get rid of so many sailors so quickly? The repatriation of Chinese seamen from Liverpool was part of a large-scale post-war repatriation effort beginning in 1945 that affected thousands of Allied ex-servicemen and refugees. But Liverpool in particular faced an acute housing problem as the second most bombed city in Britain after London. Kay Jones of the Museum of Liverpool suggests that may have provided part of the motivation.
By this point, there's an acute housing shortage. Obviously, there's the reliance on the port and the docks for employment, for the economy, but although the docks stayed open throughout the war, it was very much reduced, and they really had to think about diversifying that kind of trade and economy. And the plan for the kind of local government, the local corporation, was to move more into manufacturing. So they really had to think about providing emergency temporary accommodation for the thousands of people who were homeless, the returning servicemen, of course, and their families. So there was real pressure on the city to rebuild, but it was a real challenge thinking about where all these people could go and living in a better way than perhaps before the war too, in better standard of housing.
You've talked about the numbers of houses that were lost, but when you look at the numbers of Chinese who were expelled from Liverpool, was it really justified? Were they really part of the problem?
Well, it sounds very much like a justification, doesn't it, to get rid of the Chinese men. Obviously, it was such a small percentage of all those homeless people requiring homes. I can't imagine it would have made much of a difference.
So why did they do it, do you think?
If they were using that as an excuse, it was a solid one to go with. There's no disputing that there was this massive acute housing shortage. But of course, in reality, it really wouldn't have made that much difference or impact, would it?
Keith Coughlin rejects the idea that the Chinese men had to make way for returning British soldiers. His father, Soon Kwai Sing, was an interpreter and a doctor of medicine, yet he wasn't saved from repatriation.
The Chinese were not taking any jobs in the English or the British industry. They worked for the Blue Funnel, and the only people that worked for the Blue Funnel were people from China or the deck officers, which were British. So they weren't taking anyone's job whatsoever. They weren't taking anyone's houses, because the people who lived in these houses accommodated the Chinese people as people that could live there and pay their rent. So it was of no consequence. That is just a way of saying, let's get rid of them.
Kellyanne is also sceptical.
I understand what the government's trying to say they think happened, but the reality on the floor doesn't really match it. These men already had homes and jobs. They worked for Blue Funnel. The fact that our governments decided they needed repatriating to their country of origin, I mean, they use that word, repatriated, like they just went home and life carried on. Everybody was in turmoil. China's country was in turmoil at the time as well. It wasn't as stable as it is now. So they were deported, basically. And the government says, oh, well, they weren't all deported. Some of them were strong-armed. But if you take their papers, their legal documents, and you have in the middle of the night raids and special squads roaming the streets looking for Chinese men, that's not they chose to go home. No matter how the government words it, these people didn't choose to go home. They were rounded up and secretly and forcibly deported.
The Chinese seamen that made it back to China would have been met by shocking scenes.
During the Second World War, China made tremendous numbers of sacrifices. A lot of Chinese, many millions of Chinese died during the war, some as combat casualties, others through events such as the famine, which racked Henan province during the middle of the war in 1942 to 43. We still don't have exact numbers, but numbers that range anywhere north of 8 million, 10 million or more are certainly plausibly put forward. Another huge crisis for China was refugee flight. Many tens of millions of Chinese, some would say 80 to 100 million, became refugees inside their own country during the years of war, fleeing from one end of the country to another to try and escape the Japanese. And the infrastructure which China had created, the railways, the roads, even though they were in some ways still not fully developed, were essentially smashed into pieces because of the effects of the war. So the devastation, both in terms of the human cost and in terms of economic infrastructure on China, was absolutely devastating during World War II.
As Rana Mitter explains, the political upheaval underway in China also meant the seamen faced an uncertain state of affairs on their return.
Shanghai was a city for the first time under Chinese rule, really since 1843, and the nationalist government of China under Chiang Kai-shek, the Kuomintang, essentially made it their major international gateway and trading post. It wasn't the capital, that was at Nanjing, which was not far away, but Shanghai was certainly the major city of the Chinese Republic. On the other hand, social conditions were extremely troublesome. Many people were impoverished. The economy had not done so well during the war, and therefore there were a lot of people who were flooding back, former refugees coming back to Shanghai, who needed to find work and shelter, perhaps reclaim their old houses. And that created a significant amount of tumult. In addition, the economic situation rapidly got worse. Prices started rising. Industry was not recovering. So Shanghai was a city that had been liberated, but at the same time, it was very unclear what was going to become of it in the near future.
Many people, like Kellyanne's relatives, were left with no idea what had happened to their loved ones.
There was lots of rumours in Liverpool that China was in disturbance at the end of the war, and some of them were shipped to Shanghai, and we were told that the then nationalists may have shot them for working for the wrong side during World War II, but we don't actually know whether that's true. The only information we have on this story is what circulated within the communities in the years that followed. In the years that followed, we did become aware that they'd been deported, but we couldn't prove it. The government wasn't releasing any documentation.
Keith has spent 20 years trying to get to the bottom of his father's disappearance. He wants the truth, and he wants the descendants left behind to know they have relatives in China. I met Keith at his home in Liverpool to find out what he's discovered about his father's fate.
He was one of the people that was rounded up by the special branch during the dark nights in '46.
End of the war.
After the war, yes. And they were taken by a firm called O'Neill's, who were like a travel agency firm, who brought the Chinese seamen to and from the ships.
How do you know this detail? Who told you what happened?
I researched all this myself, and there was a lot of people like myself, whose father was full Chinese and they were half, who remembered this, because they were a lot older than me. Some of them knew my father, and there was a person there called Larry Key, and he was actually there when these incidents happened.
And what did he tell you?
He told me that they turfed them out the beds and just dragged them out to the buses and the wagons and took them down to the docks in Liverpool to be deported.
And then what happened? Do you know?
Well, I do know because I've got that in writing. They had a landing pass which gave them the privilege of staying in Liverpool as long as they didn't miss a ship when they had to go back to China. So what they done was they had all the ships ready. They had all the carpenters in, or what they called chippies, and they made bunk beds in all the holes in the ship.
So they were treated like cargo, not...
Yeah, they were treated... They were put in the cargo holds. And the ships pulled out, and they said to the men, "You've now invoked your pass. It's now become invalid because you've missed the ship." And then they brought the ships back in and then marched them onto the ships and deported them.
One of the most traumatic elements of the policy for the families was the secrecy that surrounded it. For many wives and children, the result was shame, trauma, and destitution. When her father, Chang Chang-or, was taken, Judy Kinnan's mother couldn't manage alone, and Judy was sent to live with her grandmother.
She just thought the world of him. Just thought the world of him, you know.
What effect did it have on your mother?
Terrible, because all her friends said just stress and anxiety was all. It took her a couple of years to get herself back to normal, and that's when she came back. She used to come and visit me up in Macclesfield and my grandma's a lot. Bring me dolls, prams, bring me dolls and everything, you know what I mean? And then I came back to Liverpool once she got back on her feet, you know.
That she wasn't capable of looking after you?
No, because the stress and anxiety was that bad.
She clearly loved him.
Yeah, she did. Everyone says that.
80 years on, the anguish, the frustration and the confusion over this affair still runs deep for those affected. In the next episode, we'll hear firsthand the continuing trauma of the family members left behind.
Still leaves all those feelings of loss, like you're grieving for somebody you've never met. It's your heritage, it's your part of your personal identity, and you have a right as a human being to know where you come from.
Do you know more about this story? If you do, please email sailors@cgtn.com. You've been listening to The Secret Betrayal with me, Jamie Owen. The producers were Elizabeth Mearns and Mark Ashenden. The sound editor was Terry Wilson, and the series producer, Simon Morris.